Hello YouTube! In this video we're going to look at Dialetheism, the view that there are true contradictions. So there are some propositions that are both true and false. There are some true propositions of the form P and not P. Now the most common arguments for Dialetheism appeal to semantic paradoxes such as the liar sentence. But there are also arguments for Dialetheism that appeal to social phenomena, and that's what we're going to look at in this video. The argument has been made that there are certain types of social phenomena or social processes that can bring contradictions into existence. There are contradictory social facts. So this draws mainly from the work of Graham Priest and also the article Contradiction Club by Emma Bolton and Matthew Cole. So, in his book In Contradiction, Graham Priest argues that true contradictions can arise within systems of law. First of all, within a system of contract law, there may arise inconsistent obligations. Priest gives the following example. Suppose that I form a contract with Ruben that I will attend an event at a certain time. I then form a contract with Charisse that I will not attend the event at that time. And in each case, the contract is formed and validated in the usual way. Moreover, we can suppose that each contract will be enforced. So after breaching either one of these contracts, a court will hold me liable and will award damages to the party whose contract was breached. So this is sufficient to show that these contracts have genuinely been made, and therefore under this system I genuinely have such obligations. But now this looks like an inconsistent obligation. I am obligated to attend the event, and I am obligated not to attend the event. I am obligated to attend and not attend the event. Now, an obvious immediate way out of this is to say, well, we have to relativize contradictions to particular parties. So I don't just have an obligation just in general, an obligation simpliciter to attend the event. Rather, I have an obligation to Ruben to attend the event, and I have an obligation to Charisse not to attend the event. And so there's no contradiction here. Compare, for instance, how motion is relativized to reference frames. So it is true that the Earth moves through space at about 67,000 miles per hour. It is also true that the Earth does not move through space at about 67,000 miles per hour. Now, the way that we remove that contradiction is because the motion is relative to a given reference frame, right? So relative to the reference frame of the Sun, the Earth is moving at 67,000 miles per hour. Relative to a different reference frame, like the reference frame of the Milky Way galaxy or something, then its speed is going to be different. So we could maybe make a similar sort of move here and say, well, it's not really that there's there's not any genuine inconsistency, because you are obligated to Ruben to do X and I'm obligated to Charisse not to do X. It may come about, however, that Ruben and Charisse are the same person. So let's say that I contract with my colleague Ruben to attend the event, and then later in the day I'm talking over email with somebody I believe to be called Charisse, and I form a contract with Charisse not to attend the event, but it turns out that Charisse is in fact the screen name of Ruben. Neither of us knew that we were talking to each other. This is just sort of accidental, but this could happen, and so it seems that now I have an obligation to Ruben both to attend the event and not to attend the event. So we haven't really removed the inconsistency, at least not in all cases. So the claim is that we can have inconsistent obligations. Now, does this support the view that there are true contradictions? Well, actually, not directly. So Priest points out that, what's going on in this situation is I'm contractually obligated to do X, and I'm contractually obligated not to do X. So I'm obligated both to do X and not to do X. But that's not itself a dialethia, a true contradiction. So to put this maybe a bit more formally, what's required for a true contradiction is that we have a statement of the form P and not P. Now, so far what we have is I'm obligated to do X, I'm obligated not to do X. So OX and not OX, basically. But what we would need for a dialethia, for a true contradiction, is that I am obligated to do X and it is not the case that I am obligated to do X. We would need OX and not OX. That would be a contradiction. Now, there is a fairly simple step from what we have already established to having an outright contradiction, and this is that we might endorse the principle that if you are obligated not to do X, then you are obligated, if you are obligated not to do X, then you are not obligated to do X. If you accept that principle, then of course we can get our contradiction. And this principle is accepted in standard deontic logics. Of course, anybody who buys into the idea of inconsistent obligations, anybody who's attracted to dialetheism is not going to want to accept standard deontic logics. So, that doesn't necessarily help very much here. So this principle may be intuitive, but as Priest points out, there is actually an obvious problem for any dialetheist who appeals to it in this context. If we affirm that there can be inconsistent obligations, if we affirm that I may be obligated to do X and obligated not to do X, then surely we should not say that the obligation not to do X entails that I'm not obligated to do X. So if we're already affirming the claim, so if we're already affirming OX and not, and sorry, if we're already affirming OX and O not X, right? If we have that in place already, well, and we're claiming that there are circumstances where that conjunction is true, then surely we wouldn't say that it follows from O not X that not OX, right? We've just affirmed basically a counterexample to the principle. At least that's how the anti-dialetheist will see it. So Priest says that, these cases of inconsistent obligations, they may perhaps be, telling in some ways, but we don't really get a direct contradiction from them. But he gives a different example, which he thinks is more promising, and this is the example of inconsistent laws. So consider a society, S, which has the following laws. First, only women have the right to vote. Men are prohibited from voting. And second, all landowners have the right to vote. Now then suppose that there are very rare circumstances where there are legal loopholes that allow men to become landowners. And moreover, suppose that neither of these laws has priority, right? So these laws are just sort of, on the books, and it's not the case that either one of them trumps the other. So let's say then that Sydney is a man who lives in S and he owns land. Well, the claim is that given the laws of S, Sydney has the right to vote, and it is not the case that Sydney has the right to vote. So the proposition Sydney has the right to vote is both true and false. It's a contradiction. Now, we might wonder, of course, how this sort of society could come about, but I think it's fairly easy to tell plausible stories here, right? So let's say that, men are explicitly prohibited from voting. Initially, we can kind of imagine a sort of historical development where initially there's only a very small number of women that have the right to vote, women with the right heritage, right? Like maybe it's just like aristocratic women or something, right? Then landowning women campaign for suffrage to be extended to all landowners. So this second law ends up getting passed. So we sort of have this initial law that only women have the right to vote, and then we end up getting the law that all landowners have the right to vote. And of course, the people who wrote the law that all landowners have the right to vote sort of were just assuming that, of course, men can't be landowners because they didn't realize that there were these like legal technicalities that allowed it to happen in very rare circumstances. Or we might suppose that the country has just been formed and different parts of the constitution are written by different people, and the constitution is ratified before anybody notices that, the laws might end up leading to this consequence. Regardless of the process by which these laws come about, it does seem at least possible, right? It seems possible the country could have these laws, and this, Priest says, would lead to a true contradiction, at least if somebody who's a man comes along who owns land. Now, of course, this contradictory consequence is unintended. It's unlikely that the leaders of a country are going to intend to have laws that lead to contradictions. But that doesn't show that there's no contradiction here. Laws almost always have unintended consequences, and unintended consequences are still consequences. So, suppose, for instance, that a government passes a law against face coverings in public places with the intention of cracking down on protests. Now, this law also has the consequence that burqas are banned. So burqas in public are now illegal, at least until the law is changed. This is the case even if the government didn't intend to ban burqas. Intention may be relevant to the interpretation of a law, but it doesn't trump everything, right? If the government is perfectly happy for people to wear burqas, but then they write a law banning face coverings in order to crack down on protests, well, that may have been the intention. Cracking down on protests may have been the intention, but the law says face coverings in public are illegal, so burqas are out too. So again, the fact that the contradictory consequence is unintended does not show that it doesn't obtain. It may still obtain. I guess the question here is, what exactly makes something a law, right? What has to be in place in order to have a law? A first pass, I suppose, is that we might think, well, look, if an institution with the appropriate authority passes the legislation, and if others with appropriate authority enact the legislation, then, we're going to say the law is in place. And both of these conditions may be satisfied for the two laws that we saw for Society S. So the legislature, which has appropriate authority, has passed Laws 1 and Law 2, and there are relevant groups in society that enforce Law 1 and relevant groups that enforce Law 2. Now, this point about enforcement is, of course, a little bit trickier because, of course, in practice, Sydney will either vote or he won't. He can't both cast a vote and not cast a vote, at least assuming the voting process works as it does in ordinary countries. But the claim is just that he has the right to vote and does not have the right to vote. Well, the government has passed these two laws, and people within the society may be attempting to enact both of them. So both of these laws are in force. These laws are obeyed in practice. The society is governed by those rules. Problems may arise when Sydney specifically goes to the voting booth. But, maybe Sydney's the first landowning male in the society, and things have been going smoothly for decades prior to that, right? People have been enforcing both of these laws perfectly fine for decades. So both of them are in place. Now, of course, what I've just said here, isn't enough. It's not enough just to have an appropriate authority that passes the law and then you have somebody who's trying to enforce the law, because, well, we can't stipulate just anything through the law. Suppose that a legislature passes a law saying that pi is exactly equal to 3. Well, that can't be done by law, right? We can make it a law that everybody must affirm the proposition that pi is exactly equal to 3, but no law can make it the case that pi really is equal to 3. The value of pi is not the sort of thing that can be established by law. But the thing is that voting rights are exactly the kind of thing that can be established by law. So when a state passes a law saying that, voting rights are expanded to all landowners, then Verity, if she is a landowner, will thereby gain the right to vote. Verity's enfranchisement is constituted by that law. So, this question of what kinds of things can be established by law, that's an interesting question. But surely if anything can be established by law, then voting rights are among them. Now, as Priest notes, we might object that more than this is required to make a law. There's not just the legislature. There's not just writing the law. There's also judicial interpretation. And in many cases, there are mechanisms that prevent inconsistency. There may be implicit principles that are accepted in the context of judicial interpretation that rule out inconsistency. For instance, in many jurisdictions, there is the principle of lex posterior. A later law trumps an earlier law. So if it's found that one law contradicts another, then the earlier law is taken not to be applicable. So in our example, if it was first of all established that only women have the right to vote, and then it was later established that all landowners have the right to vote, well then, when Sydney comes to the voting booth, you would say, well, he's a landowner, that's the later law, so that just overrules the earlier law. So we remove the inconsistency that way. Or consider, the preamble of a bill introducing a law may make the intentions of the legislators clear, and this might be used to remove the apparent contradiction. So in our example, the intention of the second law was to extend voting rights to all landowning women specifically. So in that case, the claim that all landowners have the right to vote would be inapplicable if it turns out that some men are landowners. It's only landowning women that have the right to vote. So we can, appeal to principles like this to remove the inconsistency. The problem with this response is that while apparent contradiction can sometimes be removed in this way, it's hard to see how it could always be removed in this way. We may be dealing with a jurisdiction that just doesn't recognise these sorts of implicit principles. And even if it does, suppose that the laws were written at the same time and that the specific intentions of the legislators are unclear. So there's just no grounds for favouring one law over the other. I mean, in practice, it's likely that the contradiction will be removed somehow, either by changing the law or by, coming up with some new creative interpretation of the law. But until that occurs, at least the Dialetheists will claim, until that change occurs, we have a true contradiction. So, let's say that Sydney's case goes to trial, right, and a judge has to decide whether or not Sydney can vote. The judge is thereby, creating a new law or changing the law in some way, in such a way as to remove the contradiction. But before that happens, well, the Dialetheist says we have the contradiction. Like, the contradiction is there, and the judge may make a decision that removes the contradiction. But before that, we have a true contradiction. A final response here, a final thought, is that, well, it might be argued that what these two laws entail, so if we have law L1 and law L2, what this entails is simply that no men are landowners. So given that these two laws are in place, Sydney just isn't a landowner. So the thought here is, look, if only women have the right to vote, and all landowners have the right to vote, well, then we just infer that all landowners are women. So to put it a bit more formally, we'd say something like what Law 1 says, right? So the first law says only women have the right to vote. So that's saying that for all X, if X has the right to vote, then X is a woman. Law 2 says that all landowners have the right to vote. So what that's saying is for all X, if X is a landowner, then X has the right to vote. And we can infer from that for all X, if X is a landowner, then X is a woman. This inference is classically valid, indeed it's valid in a range of non-classical logics too, and this does, after all, probably more closely align with how the laws were intended, because the assumption of the people writing these laws is, well, of course, men can't be landowners. So we might say that maybe this is how we get around this contradiction, is, well, it's just going to turn out that Sydney actually isn't a landowner. The problem with this move is fairly obvious, which is, well, there are, in that society, there are procedures in place for becoming a landowner, and Sydney has met the relevant conditions. Sydney is treated as a landowner by the rest of the society. His claims to own the land are respected in courts, and so on. I mean, there's just no reason to assume that L1 or L2 take priority. And these laws, in any case, they don't say anything about how a person becomes a landowner. So it's true that, the people who wrote the second law, that all landowners have the right to vote, well, yeah, maybe they assumed that no men could become landowners, but they were wrong. And, they didn't write any law that overruled the processes already in place in that society by which men become landowners. So the thought is, well, it would clearly be a mistake to infer that in this society all landowners are women on the grounds that the society has ratified laws L1 and L2. Okay, so just a quick advert. If you like my channel, you can support me on Patreon. I upload bonus videos on there, so if you want to see more of me, then join the Patreon. Throw me some cash, it's really appreciated. You can also just give a one-off donation on PayPal. And again, any support you can give, it really genuinely helps. These videos, they take a lot of time. It takes a lot of effort to put these things together. And so, having a bit of money to help pay the bills goes a long way. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy. I have a degree, a master's, and a PhD in philosophy, so those are my qualifications. Send me an email if you're interested, and there is a Discord which you can join. The links to all of this will be in the description. But let's get back to Dialetheism. So turning from the law to more everyday matters, Bolton and Cole suggest another example of practices that lead to true contradictions in their article Contradiction Club, Dialetheism and the Social World. So suppose that a group of Dialetheists set up Contradiction Club, a club for those who believe that there are true contradictions. The club's constitution specifies that there is a special member, the High Priest. This is mostly a ceremonial role, but it does come with the privilege that only the High Priest has the right to change the station of the club's radio. So after setting up the club, the role of High Priest is offered to volunteers, right? So it's just, whoever volunteers for this role gets it, basically. So everybody is asked who wants to be High Priest, and Graham raises his hand, and then everybody agrees, yep, Graham is High Priest, and they all agree to treat him as such. But then, just to check, everybody is asked who wants not to be High Priest, at which point all the members, including Graham, raise their hands, and all the members agree that Graham is indeed not the High Priest, and they agree to treat him as such. So in a straightforward way then, the club has decided that Graham both is and is not High Priest. So there are then two true contradictions here, at least according to the Dialetheist. We have the proposition Graham is High Priest, that's both true and false, and the proposition Graham is permitted to change the radio station, that's both true and false. Now, it seems fairly easy to make sense of what's going on here, right? We understand the role of the High Priest, we understand how people come to adopt that role on the basis of volunteering. Recall that with respect to the laws, we can, we might sort of argue that the legislature does not have total autonomy, and this opens the door, as we've seen, to the idea that, well, maybe there are like implicit assumptions that block the contradictions. But in the case of social clubs, it really does seem like you can just set up the rules and the roles basically by fiat, by decision. The members of Contradiction Club can decide the process by which a person becomes High Priest. And Graham has met the relevant conditions, and he's also met the relevant conditions not to be High Priest, or so the Dialetheist might say. Whether this works, of course, depends on how these sorts of social facts are created. In this case, we're dealing with the rules of a club. What could make it the fact that a person has a particular role in a club? Well, a person with appropriate authority has specified that the club includes that role. A person with appropriate authority has laid down a process by which people can take that role, and all of this is endorsed by the relevant members of the club. Maybe it's decided democratically, maybe it's decided by autocratic decree, depends on how the club is set up. But in this case, there is a process endorsed by the relevant people by which Graham is designated High Priest, and not designated High Priest. So Bolton and Hull compare Contradiction Club to Classical Club. Classical Club is a club for classical logicians who, of course, reject Dialetheism. They need to elect a leader, and they do it by offering it to volunteers. So who wants to be leader of Classical Club? One person, Bertrand, raises his hand. Everybody agrees with this, and so Bertrand is deemed the leader, and that's that. Now, presumably, few people are likely to object that the members of Classical Club have successfully elected Bertrand as their leader. So the members of Classical Club have made the proposition Bertrand is leader of Classical Club true. The social fact that Bertrand is leader of Classical Club is created by the existence of a particular institution, governed by a set of rules, laid down by some appropriate authority. And the social fact that none of the other members are leader of Classical Club is created by the same things. Now, Bolton and Hull argue that exactly the same is going on with Contradiction Club. Precisely the same kinds of processes that make it true that Bertrand is leader of Classical Club also make it true that Graham is High Priest of Contradiction Club, and that Graham is not High Priest of Contradiction Club. Although, although in one case, we have a fairly standard example of somebody becoming leader, and the other case involves a contradiction, Bolton and Holt would say there isn't really any relevant disanalogy between these cases, right? If it's true that Bertrand is leader of Classical Club, and if that's made true by the decisions of the members of the club, then we should similarly say it's true that Graham is High Priest of Contradiction Club, and that Graham is not High Priest of Contradiction Club, and that contradiction is made true by the same sorts of processes that make it true that Bertrand is leader of Classical Club. So we have another example of a true contradiction there. All right, so one objection to this is the according to objection given by J.C. Beall. So this is an objection to both the case of the clubs and the case of laws and so on. What Beall says is, look, we can grant that some contradictions are true according to such and such body of law or according to such and such set of rules, but it does not follow that contradictions are true simpliciter. Compare fiction. I can write a story according to which contradictions are true. I might write a story in which it's both true and false that an alien visitation occurred on a particular date. So then we would have, according to the fiction, P and not P. But obviously, this doesn't do anything to establish dialetheism, the claim that there are true contradictions, because all I'm saying is that something has happened within a story. Stories can be false. Similarly, according to some story, Cybermen visited the Earth from Mondas in 1986. Okay, that's a nice story. Doesn't do anything to establish that Cybermen actually visited the Earth. So similarly, all we have in the cases that we presented in this video is that according to the laws of some society, Sydney both has the right to vote and does not have the right to vote. According to Contradiction Club, Graham both is and is not High Priest, or according to the rules of Contradiction Club, or whatever. But we shouldn't infer that it's true, it's just true that Sydney both has the right to vote and doesn't have the right to vote. So does this work? Well, clearly Beall is right that merely affirming according to some body of law P, that does not in itself entail the P. But it seems that bodies of law can make certain claims just true. So it seems totally straightforward, for instance, that Penelope Maddy is one of the presidents of the American Philosophical Association. So we would also say, look, according to the rules of the APA, Penelope Maddy is one of the presidents of the APA. But then it does look like, in this case, right, given the sorts of processes that are given that what those rules are, given what that institution is and the sort of processes at play, it is just true that Penelope Maddy is one of the presidents of the APA. By establishing the relevant rules and procedures, we have made this a social fact. And similarly, so it is with Classical Club, right? Bertrand is the leader of Classical Club in virtue of the relevant rules and procedures. And then similarly, so it is for Contradiction Club. I mean, it's worth noting that if we deny this, then it looks like we're committed to a kind of error theory about a very broad class of social facts. So we would have to say that when we just say the proposition, Penelope Maddy is one of the presidents of the APA, that proposition is actually false. And this is a possible view, right? We might hold that there are no laws, no rules, no institutions, no clubs. It's not true that Penelope Maddy is president of the APA. It's not true that Bertrand is leader of Classical Club. It's not true that Graham is High Priest of Contradiction Club and is not High Priest of Contradiction Club. I mean, so we may well say that just in general, these propositions that express such social facts are uniformly false. And then maybe the reason why we say such things is that it's a useful pretense, it's a useful fiction to talk as if there are such facts. It's a useful fiction to talk as if Penelope Maddy was made one of the presidents of the APA, even though that's not really true. So the analogy with fiction, then, is perhaps tighter than we might initially have thought. We can never drop the according to operator, because these claims which supposedly state social facts, or supposed social facts, can only be true according to some social fiction or other. So, according to social fiction F, Penelope Maddie is one of the presidents of the APA. According to social fiction F1, Bertrand is leader of Classical Club. According to social fiction F2, Graham both is and is not High Priest of Contradiction Club. But if we just say Penelope Maddie is one of the presidents of the APA, that proposition, if we drop the according to operator, that proposition is just false. It's worth noting as well, there are independent motivations for this sort of view. Let's say, for example, that you endorse mereological nihilism, according to which there are no composite objects. The mereological nihilist claims there are only simples, there are only fundamental entities, whatever these fundamental entities turn out to be. So, no two objects ever compose a further object. So there are no chairs, for example, there are just particles arranged chair-wise. And it would seem to follow from this that, well, if there's no composite objects, presumably there are no people. There are no, practices, there are no institutions. Graham is High Priest of Contradiction Club could not be true because Graham doesn't exist, Contradiction Club doesn't exist, none of the practices that supposedly grant Graham this position have actually taken place. So, statements about composite objects, statements about the social world, they're all just useful fictions. The truth is so much more enormously complex. So, we simplify, we idealize, but actually these claims are just not true. So this is a possible view, but of course it's a rather extreme one. I think there's going to be relatively few philosophers who would want to take this option merely to avoid dialetheism. So, we could instead frame the argument as a conditional claim. We could say, look, if you accept that there are any social facts at all, if you accept, for instance, that it is a fact that British men have the right to vote, or that it is a fact that Penelope Maddie is president of the APA, then you should accept that there are, or at least could be, true contradictions within the social realm. You should accept that Graham both is and is not High Priest of Contradiction Club. Okay, a second response is maybe we can avoid dialetheism by appealing to truth-value gaps. So the Dialetheists has presented these examples where supposedly there are propositions that are both true and false. Now, we might grant that the social phenomena described in these examples does not make the relevant proposition just true or just false, but maybe this is because the proposition is neither true nor false. It's just indeterminate. So we might say it's neither true nor false that Sydney has the right to vote. It's neither true nor false that Graham is High Priest of Contradiction Club. Now, of course, one thing to bear in mind here is, although this avoids the commitment to true contradictions, it would still force us to revise classical logic. We would have to give up bivalence, the view that every proposition has exactly one truth value, true or false. But, maybe that's more palatable than embracing true contradictions. Maybe we prefer truth value gaps to truth value gluts. And, look, it does seem like... So it seems like we can come up with cases where at least, prima facie, bivalence fails, right? It seems like, okay, maybe there are some cases where things, of social propositions about social phenomena where they're just neither true nor false. Let's say, for instance, that a society passes the law that no children may consume alcohol. Also suppose that this society doesn't have any specific age of consent, so the term child is vague. There isn't an exact moment when a person shifts from being a child to being an adult. There are a range of ages that lie in a vague boundary between childhood and adulthood. Let's say then that Ron is 16 years old. It's indeterminate whether Ron is a child or an adult. It's not clear what Ron counts as. So you might say, well, it's just neither true nor false that Ron may consume alcohol. It's neither true nor false that he has the right to consume alcohol. Maybe that's a case of a truth-value gap. Or suppose that there's a society that passes the law that all women have the right to vote and no men have the right to vote. However, this society also recognises intersex people and non-binary people. Do these people have the right to vote? Well, maybe we say, look, the law just doesn't say anything one way or the other. So, plausibly, it's neither true nor false that they have the right to vote. It's just undetermined. Maybe we would say that. Obviously, look, these examples, I mean, you might dispute what's being said about them. I just offer them as prima facie cases of truth-value gaps. The important point here is that the examples given by dialetheists don't really seem to be like this. So where we're dealing with apparent truth-value gaps, the problem is that the social facts are, in a sense, deficient. The social facts say too little. So there's some proposition P about the social realm, and the relevant practices or institutions don't, say anything one way or the other about P, right? They don't. I mean, it's not just about what they say, but it's about like the relevant social practices and institutions do not determine P one way or the other. So we can't say whether P or not P. In the examples given by the Dialetheists, by contrast, it's rather that the social facts say too much. So we have one law that explicitly grants men the right to vote, and another law that explicitly grants one law explicitly denies men the right to vote, another law explicitly grants a certain class of men the right to vote. I mean, there's no vagueness here. There's not really any indeterminacy here. It's not that there's a failure to specify who has the right to vote. It's that it's too much information has been given. We might think that even if we grant that there can be truth-value gaps, that's not the most plausible interpretation of the sorts of examples the dialetheist has given. Okay, so another response to all of this is that there might be constraints on the creation of social facts. There might be, in some way, somehow, or some way, an underlying rule that, a person can't simultaneously hold a position and not hold a position. A person can't, simultaneously have a right and not have a right. Thomas Brower, in his article Social Inconsistency, suggests that we could appeal to institutional functions. So institutions have particular goals, and in order to serve those goals, the institution must operate in a particular way. For instance, consider the practice of greeting other people. A common way to greet people is to wave your hand or nod your head. And we could imagine other ways of greeting people. I mean, a convention might develop where we greet each other by hopping on one leg. There's all sorts of ways that we might greet each other, but there are limits. There couldn't be a convention of greeting each other by performing a mental calculation, by doing arithmetic in your head, because a greet is a public act. It requires that the other person notice you. It requires observable behavior, and a mental calculation doesn't. There's no observable behavior associated with that. So that's a limit on the practice of greeting people. Well, maybe the same sort of idea can be applied to this claim that there are true contradictions in the social realm. We might say that institutions can't create contradictions because this would in some way prevent the institution from fulfilling its purpose. Consider, for instance, laws. What's the point of a law? Well, I mean, part of the answer seems to be social coordination, right? Like, laws tell people what they can and can't do, what their obligations are to each other and to the state, right? So when I'm guiding when I'm thinking about what to do, how do I behave, how do I interact with other people, the laws, provide a sort of framework. I can't step outside the laws. I can, I have sort of autonomy, but only as long as I'm behaving within the laws. Now, with respect to voting, the question is, do we allow Sydney, a landowning man, to vote, or don't we? Well, if we both affirm and deny this, then we would have to both allow and prevent Sydney from voting. We would have to both count his vote and not count it. But obviously that's impossible, right? We can't do that. So a contradictory law would be an inapplicable law. It wouldn't be able to properly serve this function of social coordination. We have to decide whether, Sydney gets to vote or he doesn't, and that's that. And maybe, the same sort of problem arises for roles within institutions. Institutional roles come with certain rights and responsibilities. The High Priest's rights to change the radio station. If we say that Graham both is and is not High Priest, well, do we allow him to change the radio or don't we? So maybe this is a problem, right? So maybe the thought is that these, if there were true contradictions here, then they would block the institution from performing its function, and that's why there can't be true contradictions here. Now, there are two questions about this. I mean, first of all, we might wonder whether institutional functions really impose such tight constraints on the sorts of social facts that the institution creates. And it seems like we could imagine an institution that lays down a law or a rule that prevents or interferes with the proper functioning of the institution. For instance, a parliament might inadvertently make a law which exempts some class of the population from any legal punishment. You know, um, maybe when they're like writing the tax code or something, they end up inadvertently exempting, men who have been to war from ever paying tax or something like that. It seems like there could be laws that end up undermining the very rule of law itself. Um, Similarly, there may well be laws that are just really complex and technical and basically impossible for people to follow in practice. Indeed, that's probably the case for some of our laws. Even the police, whose job it is to enforce the law, are often unaware of legal technicalities. Laws need not be easily applicable. And recall, in the case that we gave of the Society S, the two laws in that case only cause trouble when Sydney turns up to the voting booth. Prior to that, things may have been running, again, perfectly smoothly. They may have been running perfectly smoothly for decades. We only run into an issue when Sydney turns up. So in any case, the point is, we might think, well, sure, there's some sense in which if we have a true contradiction, this is going to kind of interfere with some of the things that these institutions are doing. But it's not clear that that in itself is enough to show that there is no contradiction. It's not clear that the goal of an institution or the function of an institution imposes such a tight constraint on the sorts of social facts that that institution creates. The second issue here is, well, how do we determine the function of an institution? So whether the instantiation of a contradiction would interfere with the function of an institution seems to depend on what that function is. I mean, after all, with respect to Contradiction Club, we might kind of turn the tables here. We might say, well, look, given that one of the basic goals of Contradiction Club is to promote the view that there are true contradictions, realizing a contradiction, instantiating a contradiction, seems to be, in some ways at least, supportive of at least one of the functions of that institution. Now, granted, there are other functions we can cite for which this contradiction causes problems. As noted, it makes, behavioral coordination a bit more problematic. Do we allow the high priest to change the radio or don't we? But then why should that function trump the function of promoting true contradictions? The promotion of true contradictions is, after all, the important thing as far as the members of the club are concerned. That's literally what the club was designed to do. Whether we allow Graham to change the radio isn't really that important. And again, the high priest is pretty much just a ceremonial role anyway, so we don't really care about, about the rights and responsibilities there. So maybe this works, right? Maybe there are these sorts of constraints that follow from functions, but there are some issues with that. Okay, so all of these examples of contradictions that are supposedly arise within laws and clubs and so on, they draw attention to a more general point. There's nothing particularly unusual about people holding inconsistent beliefs. Humans are fallible, and even if we try to be consistent, we often fail because we're not aware of all of the consequences of what we believe. I may believe some proposition A, which unbeknownst to me entails that P, while also believing some proposition B, which unbeknownst to me entails that not P. That's perfectly common. Now, the fact that people believe things that entail inconsistencies, that's no argument for Dialetheism, because we just say, well, one of those beliefs must be false. So people believing inconsistencies, people having inconsistent thoughts and so on, that's just a special case of the fact that people can hold false beliefs. That in itself is not really that interesting. Where it does get a bit more interesting, though, is that there's a certain class of social facts that seem to be constituted partly by people's beliefs and thoughts. This seems to be the case for laws, for rights that follow from laws, for clubs and roles within clubs. What makes it the case that a person is a leader of a club is, at least partly, that certain relevant people believe that the person is the leader of the club. So notice that if all the members of a club believe that there is the role of leader and that there's some process by which a person becomes leader, then that's really all it takes for there to be this role. It wouldn't make sense to say, well, those beliefs could be false. At least if we're putting aside the more extreme, error theory sorts of views we discussed earlier. So everybody in Classical Club agrees that leaders are selected by volunteering. Bertrand volunteered, and everybody in Classical Club agrees that Bertrand is therefore leader. It would be very weird to say to them, like, no, you're all incorrect. Leaders in your club are selected through trial by combat. It's like, well, hang on, no. Like, the club members, we decide how this works, right? We have the final say here. So the thought is, look, there are some social facts that are partly constituted by beliefs and thoughts, but if that's right, then since we all acknowledge that people's beliefs and thoughts can be inconsistent, it isn't surprising that inconsistency can spread to the social domain. There's no obvious mechanism that could ensure that inconsistency remains like quarantined within the beliefs of individuals when those beliefs can be partly constitutive of what the social facts are. So maybe Dialetheism in this domain is not really even that surprising. But of course, it's still very controversial. Anyway, that's all I'm going to talk about today, and I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.